something that the Apostle Paul writes to the people in Corinth. And it's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. Here's what he writes. He says, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives in you?" And if you notice here, we've highlighted, underlined God's temple. So what I want you to do just for a moment, would you just kind of read that to yourself and kind of think about that, God's temple. I can see the impact on your face already. We're going through this journey of the adult life of Jesus. And what we've said through this series is that Jesus shows up and he brings something brand new with him. He brings three things that we're going to be talking about over the few weeks that we've already started and the few weeks we still have left all the way up to Easter. We're saying he brings a new covenant. We know that there was a covenant that God made with the children of Israel, but Jesus brings a new covenant between God and man. Not just a specific group of people, but all the people, all included, an all-scape, if you will. He brings a new command, which we'll look at in a couple of weeks, and then he brings this new movement. And you're sitting here, you're in that new movement, you're in the church that Jesus establishes. And we saw a little bit of how Jesus was different in the way that he spoke and the way that he did things. And we looked at the Sermon on the Mount, and what we said was that as Jesus shared the Sermon on the Mount, and maybe you remember it if you've ever heard sermons on it, or maybe you've read it at some point, where it says, blessed are thee, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, and blessed are those. And then he says things like, you've heard it said, but I said. And we believe, scholars believe that Jesus carried this same message over and over and over again to all the different places that he went. That was kind of his sermon that he spread everywhere. And so we see it kind of like one time, but it's preached over and over again. And what was interesting was when he would say things like, "You've heard it said." Well, what had they heard said? Well, they'd heard the law of Moses. You've heard it said. All the way from growing up, all the way now to however old that they were, they heard these things that Jesus was saying. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I said, and it appeared as if he was in contrast with Moses and what he was saying. And Moses, here's these Jewish people that everybody knew Moses, everybody knew, him. They knew of the laws of Moses, the trip up to Mount Sinai and bringing, we know the 10 Commandments, or at least know some of them. And so, here's this group of people, and they're going, wait a minute, Jesus, all right, this is different. This is something unusual. This feels fun. There's this tension that Jesus would cause. And then we looked at this, and this was kind of interesting. He says this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. He says, Jesus is saying this, he goes, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets." Well, what's the law and the prophets? It's the Old Testament. It's right here. It's the Hebrew Scriptures. That was the law and the prophets. That's what he's talking about. From Exodus all the way, to Malachi. He goes, don't think I've come to abolish it. I didn't come to get rid of it. I have not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. Jesus is saying, I didn't come to get rid of it. I came to fulfill it. In other words, if it was an assignment, I'd come to complete it. And when Jesus was done talking to these crowds, what was their response? What was their thoughts about what Jesus had said? And here's what we found out in Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, 29. This is just reviewed. He said, when Jesus had finished saying these things, this is, the Sermon on the Mount essentially, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. He had captured their attention. He was a master communicator, and he had captured their attention. It was things that, we've heard it said, but you're saying it differently. This is something new. He goes on, because he taught as one who had authority. and not as the teachers of the law. They had all listened to the Pharisees. They listened to the Sadducees. They listened to these different philosophies and philosophers and theologians. And they'd gotten pretty close to a lot of the same information. There were some differences in kind of some belief systems, the same as we have right now. But the people were listening, and they go, something is so different about this guy. Could it possibly be that Jesus is the one we've been waiting for, that Messiah, that one? Could it be him? The religious leaders go, we got to kind of stay close to this guy. We got to kind of stay, close enough we can listen, because the crowds are getting bigger, and they're getting bigger. And more people are starting to kind of follow this Jesus guy. So we need to keep some guys on this. We need to kind of figure out what he's doing, what he's saying, and see if we can kind of find maybe a flaw in him that we can kind of we can kind of take it and go, oh, look here. We found something that Jesus did that he shouldn't be doing. Which brings us to today. Matthew chapter 12, verse number 1. Jesus and his guys, they're just kind of going along. And it's on a Sabbath day. Now, Sabbath, a lot of times, people go, Sabbath, oh, that's Sunday. That's the day of worship. It's not, okay? Yes, Sunday's the day that we worship. We come to church and we do our things. But for the Hebrews, for the Jewish people, it's Friday night, sundown, to Saturday, sundown. Okay? And so, here's Jesus and his guys. They're walking along. Verse number 1. He says, at this time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Okay? On the Sabbath day, his disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of corn. And so, on the Sabbath day, there were certain rules, there were certain laws that you had to follow. And so, when we look at the Ten Commandments, what's one of the Ten Commandments? Honor the Sabbath, right? And so here he is, the guys are picking the corn. And here's what the response of the Pharisees that are kind of with Jesus, kind of watching the crowds with Jesus and his guys. When the Pharisees saw this, verse 2, they said, look, in other words, we got you now. We got you now. We've got a flaw here. We're going to kind of, hang on this. He says, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath day. They're going, you can't pick corn on the Sabbath day. You can't work on the Sabbath day. And Jesus is like, seriously? I mean, he didn't say that. It's kind of paraphrase, but he's kind of like, are you serious? Seriously, you're going with that. I mean, then Jesus says something. He says this in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Jesus says something that caught the attention of the crowd. Made the religious people kind of go, He said this. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This was huge. This was huge. Jesus is saying, you got it backwards. The people were more concerned about not breaking the law. Where was their focus? I mean, their focus was the religious leaders. The religious leaders were always looking for the gotcha. We're just looking for you to, just to mess up, and then we just, we got you to step across that line where we go, hey, you're breaking the law, you're breaking the law. And Jesus comes along and he says, you got it all backwards. God set up this day of rest, not just as not as a law to be obeyed in the sense that you're taking it. It says it's for the rest of for people to rest. Why do you think that we set up laws in our school zones for people to slow down? Typically it's 20 to 25 miles per hour in our school zones, right? You've got 40 miles an hour, all of a sudden you come up to a school zone and it goes down to 25 miles per hour. We as the people, I think we agree with that law. Some of us may say, well, it might need to go a little slower. And so, why is that law there? I mean, is that law there to make you late for work? Because, you're kind of in a hurry and all of a sudden school another school zone. Is it there to make you late for work? Is it for the school system? Is it just, to make the school system better? Is that what it's for? Is that what that law is there? Or could it be that law is there You know, so that the police can get you. Right? You know, they can get more tickets. You know, maybe that's why the law is there. Or could it be that the law is there for who? Our kids, our children. We want them safe. We want them protected. And so, you know, that's what we want. That's why that law is there, because we want to protect our children, not for revenue. Let's say, for instance, you're a half a mile away from the school zone. You're half a mile away from the school zone. You look up in your rearview mirror, and all of a sudden you see the red lights. And so you pull over, and the officer comes up, and he says, you know why I stopped? And you say something like this. You say, because you thought I had donuts hidden underneath my seat. Not a good idea to say that. You go, no, officer, I really don't. I was doing the speed limit. Because you're a half a mile from the school zone, and you hadn't started slowing down. So I need to see your license and registration. And he begins to write you out a ticket. What are your thoughts going to be? How dare what? There's a law. I didn't know a law. Is there a law about that? I mean, you'd be upset about this, and rightfully so, because you're a half a mile away from the school zone, and all of a sudden he's saying this. And so that's kind of what the Pharisees did. They set up laws so you wouldn't break the laws, and so many times it became very convoluted, and it was hard to understand it. And so we look at this, and Jesus is telling him, he goes, you think God loves his law more than he loves the people. You know, in essence, this is legalism. It's legalism. So some of you have experienced legalism in religion. You know, I grew up in a church, and I loved the church that I grew up in. I learned so much. But there were a lot of things that I kind of scratched my head and went, I don't think that doesn't seem right. That doesn't feel right. Maybe you grew up in the same kind of church where, ladies, what did you have to wear every Sunday? Dresses, right? You know, the church I grew up in, you could wear pants one time. And they just kind of looked. If you showed up a second time, somebody was probably going to talk to you about wearing your pants instead of a dress. It was interesting. I ran into a youth leader that I had when I was growing up. He was here for a funeral and was working with a funeral company, and we had an opportunity to kind of reminisce. And he says, I'm going to have to bring my wife back out here to see you at some point. She'd be so excited to see what's going on here and what you're doing. And so a couple of weeks went by. They came by on a Wednesday. I hadn't arrived yet. And so they pulled up, and it was a Wednesday evening, and he came inside looking for me. And I believe it was Kim or somebody. They tell me the story later on. And they said, hey, we were looking for David, and my wife stayed out in the car because she was wearing pants and didn't want to come in. And so I thought, I'm so glad that she didn't come in, because they would have seen girls in shorts. You know, it's so, you know, and that's kind of our mindset and stuff. And here's what happens. Legalism always prioritizes a view over a you. Let me say that again. Legalism always prioritizes a view over a you. You know, you may have quit going to church because someone prioritized a view over you. Over and over again, we see Jesus step up and he corrects the religious leaders, and he said, you know, here you are, you're using the law of God to dishonor people that are made in the image of God. And so Jesus brings something so much different, so different. And what was so different is that Jesus put people first. But the religious leaders, they didn't like it. They were threatened by it, because Jesus was attracting the crowds, and the crowds were getting bigger, and they didn't understand all the things that Jesus said, but they knew that Jesus seemed to be more interested in them than in just obeying the laws. And so Jesus goes on. Verse number 3 in Matthew chapter 12. He goes on and he answers the religious leaders. He goes, haven't you read what David did when he was with his companions and were hungry? So he kind of goes back to an event that he knew they'd be familiar with. And he goes, he entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest. This was the law again of the priest, not one of the big commandments. He goes, or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priest in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? To which we go, what is he saying? He's saying, your own people work on Sunday. You work on Sunday. Occasionally I have people, I say, hey, what you come to? I work on Sunday. So do I. But come on anyway. And so Jesus goes, look, you're working on Sunday and you're getting on to people for working on Sabbath. On Sabbath. We say Sunday, but on the Sabbath. And then Jesus says something that was so huge. It was a shock factor. Verse number 6. Jesus says this to these religious leaders and to the crowd. He says, I tell you that one greater than the one in the temple is here. Which these people had to kind of stop and go, what did he say? He said something greater than the temple is here. To which this crowd of people and these religious leaders would have been, they had to think that either Jesus was arrogant, ignorant, but he was definitely blasphemous. That a threat, that something greater than the temple, no way. That a threat to the temple was a threat to the people, that there was nothing greater than our temple. That the temple was where God was. The temple was where we made our sacrifices. That was our connection to God. The temple was where we stored the laws of Moses, the ones that Jesus said, you've heard it said. That's where that's stored. The temple, something greater than the temple? Come on, Jesus. I mean, our people, the Jewish people have died over the years for the temple, for the protection of the temple. An example would have been 7 years after Jesus says this. 7 years after Jesus says this, 48 AD 40. The emperor, the emperor of the time. There you go. The emperor at the time, he makes a statue of himself. He makes a statue of himself. And he says, I want this statue. I want it put into the temple of the Jews. I want it transported from Rome, and I want it transported to the Jews. And so he contacts Petronius, the governor of Syria. And he says, here's your assignment. You make sure my statue gets placed into the tomb or into the temple of the Jews. And so Petronius knows this isn't going to fare well. This is not going to go well. They're not just going to go, hey, yeah, bring it on in. Set it right over here. That's not going to happen. And so Petronius, he activates the Roman army that he is over, and he says, everybody head to the port. And so they head to the port. Meanwhile, the Jewish people had got the information that they're bringing this statue in of the emperor to be placed into the temple, their temple. And so thousands of the Jews met there at the port. And there they are. They're face to face with the Roman soldiers who are watching this statue be offloaded. And they're there, and Petronius is expecting, there to be a battle, essentially, there. And so the soldiers are ready. They're ready to protect. He's ready to carry out the orders. However, the Jewish people do something that was incredibly unusual. Instead of fighting, because they knew that they were no match to the Roman army, they went down on their knees and they pulled their cloaks back to their necks. And they walked away and they said, you will have to kill us to get past us. Petronius and the military was able to work their way around the Jewish people. They got all the way to Tiberias. When they got to Tiberias, there were even more Jewish people. There were thousands and thousands of Jewish people. Josephus, the Jewish historian, look it up, fact check it. You can take a look at this very event that we're talking about. He says this. He says, basically, these Jews are there. They're there to stop the statue from coming into Jerusalem. He said, so they threw themselves down upon their faces, and they stretched out their throats, and they were ready to be slain, and they did this for 40 days. So for 40 days, the farmers were on strike. For 40 days, the merchants said, we're not selling anything. For 40 days, everything came to a halt. It got to a point that Petronius knew that if he was to force this, it would be genocide. That he would have to kill thousands and thousands and thousands of Jewish people who had knelt down on their knees, pulled their cloaks back, and said, you will have to kill us. This is how much that the temple meant to these people. So Petronius does something that is so bizarre. He writes a letter. He writes a letter to the emperor. And in writing this letter, Petronius knew this could be a death warrant for himself. This, at the least, he would be removed from his position. But more than likely, he himself, the order would be given for him to be killed because he had not carried out the order of the emperor. Well, as fate would have it, or we could say God intervened. The senators, inspired with the Praetorian Guard, and essentially they assassinated the emperor. And the crisis was over. And Jesus says, I tell you, one greater than the temple is here. I mean, that's impossible. Nothing was greater than the temple. You know, there was the first temple that David designed and Solomon, built, in 586 BC. Here's this incredible temple. And the Babylonians come in and they conquer Jerusalem, and they begin to tear down the temple. And they take the things from the temple, and it's destroyed. 70 years later, the Persian Emperor Cyrus, he comes along and he says, okay, you've been petitioning for your temple to rebuild. I'm going to let you build a small temple. Nothing like you had before. You can build a small temple. So he allows them to build this small temple. And you can look back at the scripture and stuff. But here the people that had seen the glory of the temple that David had designed and Solomon had built, now they see this little temple, versus the grandeur of the temple that they had. And the verses tell us that they wept over, what we had and now what we have. About 20 years before Jesus was born, 20 years before Jesus was born, King Herod approaches the Jewish people. And he says to them, he goes, look, I want to rebuild your temple. I want to bring it back to the glory days. I want to build you something that is so incredible. That is something that people from all around want to come and see your temple. And so negotiations started, and they kind of tweaked, here's what we want, here's what needs to happen, all that kind of stuff. And they begin to build this temple. Matter of fact, here's a picture of the model of the temple that they built. Incredible architectural design and the way that it was built. This temple was built on 37 acres. It had 100-foot walls in different places around the temple. The temple structure itself was 60-foot tall walls. What was so amazing about this temple was a lot of it was made out of cut stone. There were stones that were 11 foot by 16 foot by 40 foot or 44 foot long. Some of these stones weighed over 550 tons. He built an earthquake-proof temple. That earthquakes would not destroy this. In this time period especially, there were all kinds of earthquakes. And you can look back in history and see all the different structures and the buildings and the cities that were destroyed. Herod had built an earthquake-proof temple. And Jesus comes along. Jesus comes along and he says, something greater than this temple? Something greater than this temple? I mean, come on. One day Jesus and his guys, they're at the temple. They're at this temple. What we see here is a model. Because it's not like this anymore. They're at this temple. And they're still amazed. They're marveled at this architecture. There was nothing that resembled what this looked like. Nothing that anybody else had ever seen. And his disciples, they're amazed by it. And every time they went by it, here's what they said in Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13, verse 1. They go, look, teacher. Look, teacher. What massive stones. What magnificent buildings. I mean, teacher, there's nothing like this. I mean, every time they saw it, it was overwhelming. It would make you pause and once more look at the building. And Jesus stops. And his guys are there. His core followers are with him. And Jesus stops. And what he says is epic. What he says would disturb these guys. It would cause them all kinds of tension and discomfort. And what he says is incredible. Verse 2 of Mark chapter 13. Here's what he says. He says, do you see all these buildings? They're like, yeah, that's what we're saying. Look, right here, Jesus. He says, not one stone, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. To which his disciples probably thought, Jesus, look at this. I can't even reach the top of this stone. Look, it goes from here. Oh, I mean, way down there. I mean, Jesus, you're talking about these stones. You mean these stones will be thrown down there into the valley? I mean, Jesus, that's impossible. Earthquakes have come. And yeah, there's maybe a crack here or there in some places and stuff, but Jesus, it hasn't budged. It's still there. I mean, Jesus, it would be nearly impossible. It would be nearly impossible for that to happen. Jesus, for that to happen, it would take legions of Roman soldiers to move these stones and to throw them in. And why would Rome do that? I mean, Rome, they were the ones that built this. They're the ones, I mean, under Herod's direction and everything, has said this was okay. Why would they do that? That's not possible. But it was disturbing. And so they leave and they go down to the Mount of Olives, which when you got down to the Mount of Olives, and even still today, you go down to the Mount of Olives and you look up and you see the city of Jerusalem. You look straight and there it is. And so here's this guys, and they're looking up again at this incredible structure, the temple. And here's what they said. Mark chapter 13, verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite of the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately. He said, tell us when these things will happen. I mean, when is this going to happen? And so he did. You want to know what Jesus told him? Here's your homework, son. Look it up for yourself. Matthew chapter 24. Mark chapter 13. Luke chapter 21. Matthew writes about it. Mark writes about it. Luke writes about it. And he says things like, the armies will surround the city. Flee from the city. Don't go to the city. Flee from the city. You know, pray that you're not pregnant or nursing, being a nursing mother. That the unthinkable is coming and is coming before this generation is gone. This was unimaginable to these guys. Unimaginable. These guys were wondering, was this another one of your metaphors? Was this a parable? Or was this a prophecy? Was this for real? 40 years later. 40 years later. Look it up. Fact check. The unimaginable happened. The Jews had had enough being under the boot of the Romans. And they rose up and they battled with some of the Roman soldiers. And they had a victory. And this victory fueled the energy that they needed. And the young Jewish men said, we can take on the Romans. We can destroy Rome. We can conquer Rome. We can be free again. The older Jews were like, bad idea. This is a horrible idea. And so small gangs of Jewish men and small little armies, if you will, they begin to fight the Romans and fight the Romans and fight the Romans. Until finally, Rome said enough is enough. Enough is enough. And they sent in the 10th Legion. And the 10th Legion comes in. And Thespian is the Roman emperor at the time. And he tells them, he says, look, here's what I want you to do. I want you to surround the city. I want you to seize the city. In other words, we're going to surround it. We're going to starve them out. There's going to be battles here and there and everything, but the walls appear to be impenetrable. You know, it's a great structure. It's a great fortress, if you will. But eventually they're going to run out of food. For 4 years this goes on. And at a time of festival, people were coming in for the Passover. And at first, you know, they told us, can't go in, can't go in, can't go in. And the emperor sent word and said, no. Let them in. Let them in. Let all the people into the city that you want. Let them all in. And they did, and they filled that city up with the Jewish people for their festival. Unbeknownst to them, it was the plan of the Romans. Because they knew that if they were in the city and they couldn't get out, eventually the food supply would diminish. And that's exactly what began to happen. There began to be infighting at nighttime amongst themselves as to who's going to be king, who's going to be leader. And then in the daytime, they were fighting the Romans. And over again, eventually, they had a fire that started within the city. And their food supply was burned up. And pretty soon, the Roman army began to penetrate the wall. And then the unimagined happened. The Roman soldiers went into Jerusalem, and they had no mercy. They'd been waiting a long time. They put up with the Jewish people for a long time. A lot of anger had been built up. And they did not show mercy. They killed every living person they could. And then they went to the temple. And they began to push these monstrosity of stones. And they began to push them off of the temple court. And they pushed them off into the southwest corner. And they began to tear this temple down completely. You can go to the southwest corner of that same court. That court is still there. You can go to that southwest corner and you will see the stones. Go on there and check, Google it if you want to, fact check it. It really happened. And on that day, ancient Judaism died. Never to be resurrected. Just as Jesus had predicted. You can go there today. You can go to the plaza, and you've seen pictures. You've seen it on the news and everything. There's the temple court, if you will, is there. And there's that gold dome. You've seen it, you know, that gold dome right there. That's a mosque. And just several feet, you know, away from that is a second mosque that is built. The Muslims actually control that upper plaza area where that's at, where the temple sat at one time. Wars have been fought over and over again over the years on this piece of real estate. Buildings have fallen from earthquakes. The buildings that are there now, actually, some of them were destroyed and rebuilt. And so Judaism on that day, August the 6th, or 8th, August the 6th, 70, or AD 70. Judaism was out of business. There was no more sacrifices. No more animal sacrifices could be made. And Jesus said in Mark chapter 13:2, he said, no stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown. And that's exactly what happened. Now, why is this so important? Why would this even be so important? Why do we even go through all that? You have your big history lesson, and some of you love history. You're like, oh man, give me more. So we're like, you know, tell me a story about something else. Here's the thing. Years after the deaths of Peter and Andrew and Matthew, who in other writings we find are martyrs, years after the death of Paul, the apostle who writes the vast majority of our New Testament, years later, there are Christians of years later, a couple of hundred years later, 100 years later, there are Christians. And they have the writings. They have the writings of Mark. They have the writings of Luke. They have the writings of Matthew. They have their writings. And in those writings, there is nothing said about this event that occurred in AD 70. Okay, 70. Jesus' crucifixion, we believe, was somewhere around 33, 34. So, math, we could say around 40 years later, this happens. Accelerate now, that generation has passed. It's gone. They're all gone. Now you're 100 years later. But you still have the writings of Matthew, you have the writings of Luke, and you have the writings of Mark. And you kind of go, well, why is this even important? Well, because when you read those writings over and over again, they would say things like, and Jesus said, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then it happened. Da-da-da-da. And then Jesus, he told us this, and then da-da-da-da. It happened. I mean, over and over and over again. So, here's our question. Here's my question. Why isn't that written? I mean, that's such a huge event. Why would that not be written in Matthew? Why would it not be written in Mark? Why would it not be written in Luke? Because it hadn't happened when they wrote it. Why is that important? Because my guess is if you went to college, you're in college, and your college professor said, those writings, that fiction, that thing you call the Bible, the Gospels, they were written hundreds of years later, 200-300 years later, after the fact, and people just kind of took information and they copied this and they copied that. No. It was written a whole lot closer. It was written before 70 or AD 70. It was written closer to the time. These people were still alive. Other people were alive. This is so extremely important when it comes to your faith and what you hang on to, and when people that are so much smarter than you begin to try to tear it down. This scholar after scholar after scholar that are far smarter than I say the most logical reason why you don't see it is because it hadn't happened yet. The temple was everything. The temple was everything to the Jewish people. Now it was gone. It's gone. Our temple is gone. Where are we going to go worship? Where are we going to go meet God? Where are we going to have our sins forgiven? Where are we going to do our sacrifices? Where do we go when we have problems? Where do we go? It's gone. It's gone. Where do we find God now? 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul is talking to a group of Christians. Remember you read it. But when you read it earlier, you saw, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple? And you kind of went, okay, God's temple. And that God's Spirit lives in you. You see, if you lived in that time, if you lived in that moment and your temple was gone, everything that you imagined about it, everything you heard about it, maybe seen it, and now the Apostle Paul says, you are the temple of God. You are that magnificent structure that you looked at, that God dwelt in. You are that structure. He wanted those people to understand it, to be so clear. And he says this again in chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians, verse 19 and 20. He says, don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? You're wondering if God left and he's gone. He's not. You wonder where he's at? He's living in you. He's living in you. Can you imagine how those people must have felt in that moment? In that time, whenever that they felt like, oh, God's gone. He's left us abandoned. I mean, obviously, our God's not as strong as the gods of the Roman gods because they destroyed our temple. That was that thinking in that era of time. And Paul goes along with those. The temple's not a place. It's you. Don't you know your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you? whom you have received from God. You are not your own. You're bought with a price. Oh man, it was a big price. It was the price of Christ sacrificed for you for the sins of the world. And he goes, therefore, honor God with your body. So what does that mean to us? What does that mean for you and I? I mean, we don't have that grasp necessarily what that temple looked like. But what does that mean? That the Spirit of God lives in us? That it lives in us, not in a building, not in a piece of real estate. That there are no more sacred buildings. There are no more sacred lands. There are no more sacred sites. If that makes you feel funny inside, if that makes you feel kind of, then you feel a little bit of that tension. You feel a little bit of that tension with faith. And Jesus said, there's something greater than the temple. That's it. You see, I grew up with, this is the house of God. How many of you grew up with that? The church up there, this is the house of God, and you will act, you will do, you don't go, you don't dress, I used to think as a kid, man, God's got a lot of rooms in this house. Now let me say this. Do you show respect and everything, within? Absolutely. Are we good stewards? You bet. But it's just a building. Jesus said, this is just a building. This is a piece of real estate. Yeah, wonderful things may have happened, events in your life and decisions made within that structure. But that's all it is. Jesus would say it's just that. That God, what is most important. Jesus said, you want to know what's sacred to me? You want to know what's sacred to me? It's not a building, it's not a structure, it's not a piece of property. You want to know what's sacred to me? Is that person sitting to your left? Is that person sitting to your right? Is that person behind you? Is that person in front of you? Is the person that you're married to? Is that person that you work with? Is that person that you work for? Is that man? Is that woman? Is that teenager? It is that boy and it is that girl. And he was saying they have immeasurable value to me and should be treated as such. I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. When Jesus stepped into the pages of history, light and the love of God was released into the world. You see, Jesus' original invitation still stands. It still stands of follow me. Follow me and find abundant life. Follow me and find life. Follow me and find the meaning of life. Follow me and find the purpose of life. Follow me and find satisfaction in life. Follow me and find eternity in life. Follow me and find life, of influence. Follow me and find a life that makes a difference in the lives of others. Follow me not because of your faith, but because I am faithful. I can be trusted. I will do what I say I will do. Do it. You want to know what's most important to me? You want to know? The lost places you are. You are. And the person beside you. And the person you don't even like. Sorry. Yeah. They're most safe. Something greater than the temple? I'm going to ask you to bow your heads this morning. Thank you so much for your attention. Something that God has been working on me for a while, and it's still a work in progress. He's trying to see others as Jesus saw them. You've heard when we say things like, using the question, what does love require of me in situations? And really what I'm saying is, what does Jesus require of me? What would that look like on Facebook? If we treated people as if they were sacred. Not treating people as others would treat us. As we'll find out in a couple of weeks, there's something so much bigger than that. What would it look like in our conversations? And how we treated others? And how we looked at others? It's more than just about a place in heaven someday. That's the bonus. That's the benefit of getting to spend eternity with Christ. But we have responsibilities here and now. Every one of us. Because to treat anybody any differently, it's like someone treating one of your kids poorly. You know how that works. You know what you think about that when that person does that? What is our Heavenly Father as we treat others? Dishonor. What can we do different? My prayer almost every single day. It's part of the Lord's Prayer. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. God, help me to see people as you see. God, help me to treat people as you would want to treat them. Help me to say things that you would say, and sometimes it's tough love. Here's my challenge. You can walk out this door and nothing be different. Or you can take this and chew on it. Think about it a while. Tomorrow when you pray, help me, bless people, others, take care of things, help so and so. Would you put it in? God help me to see others as you see them, to treat others as you would treat them. Heavenly Father, if every person that calls themselves a Christian and believer, if we all did that, and we all Father, what would that look like? Father, I think we got a glimpse of it in the 1st and 2nd century of your church. Why it grew, why it flourished under the persecution. Father, help us to be like those people. To be bold, disciplined, courageous, loving. Help us to be like you. Father, we ask this in your Son's precious name.